Hey everyone, welcome to the wonderful world of online learning. I'm going to try and make this relatively simple. We have a couple of things I want us to do in this meeting today in regards to talking about students with emotional and behavioral disorders. At any point in time, I would like you to stop the video, take a break, do what you need to do. Basically, this is a lecture in which I will have you stop my recording with the PowerPoint, possibly go then to Blackboard to review some video that's up there. I find it much easier to have you do that than try and stream it with captions in the Zoom platform that I'm using to record this particular segment of it. Then when you're done looking at a video, then you can come back and rejoin me back on this foray into a lecture. At any point in time during the week, if you have questions, concerns, or wish to talk about the content, you know that I'm available, and I also can set up a Zoom virtual office meeting. As you can see in back of me, I'm in my home office. As you see, there's my printer and all sorts of other things. I even have my coffee. So get settled in. And I am going to now screen share with you the PowerPoint class notes that is actually up on Blackboard. Sorry, lost my train of thought while I go forward. So I'm going to go down here, do a share, hit my PowerPoint, make sure that this is full screen, and you see me up in the upper right-hand corner. So today, really what we're going to do is talk about identifying some of the characteristics that define these students, speak about the compare and contrast of what externalizing and internalizing behaviors are, describe the causes, and also maybe I'll talk about the services and the instructional opportunities for students who do have these types of disorders. Right this moment, I want you to just kind of take a breath. We are living in extraordinarily anxious times, and I'm sure that right now everyone else around you is running around with their hair on fire. People who are juggling work and school, yourselves are included in that. Some people are working with kids at home, are not really knowing what's going on a day-to-day basis. So some of that is absolutely, without question, real typical, because the anxiety that all of us feel around us really truly is because of the fact that we really don't know what life is going to be like going forward, even tomorrow. So with that, I'd like to try and have everybody take a big deep breath, be that person who is a bit more level-headed, knowing that you need to seek out your own self-care. So we're going to go forward. The thing that's really interesting, if you think about it, is that our students, especially those who have emotional or behavioral disorders, really feel like this all the time. So part of our job as teachers is to provide support, have high expectations, but also know that that's who they are as individuals. So think about Emily. She was the young woman who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And one of the things that, as in the movie, was spoken about was Emily was not necessarily the best candidate for fully inclusive practice in school. Despite many people's best efforts, she still did not have the services that were helpful to her, that afforded her that sort of wraparound security with everything else going on. And she did ultimately attempt suicide. Fortunately for her, as well as the people who love her, that it was not possible that she actually carried out her own suicide death. And she is recovering with the help of a lot of people in her life. So if you stop the video now and go to the video that's on Blackboard and review Nadine Burke-Harris. Her TED Talk is about how childhood trauma affects health across a lifetime. And we will speak about a gentleman named Dr. Ginsburg, who also uses ACEs, which is the acute childhood test, to see what is going on with our students who are affected in ways that many of us don't necessarily see on the surface. So take a moment, pause this video, go to Blackboard, and the link should be towards the bottom of this week's folder. Now that you're back, the cool thing is that Nadine Burke-Harris was appointed to be the first ever state Surgeon General here in California. So we have her as an amazing resource now. And that's really sort of terrific. So when we look at defining emotional or behavioral disturbance, the federal definition, remember, IDEA, is something that speaks to the condition of a child in regards to how it affects their educational performance. The thing is that the federal definition is pretty slippery. If you look at how it speaks to an inability to learn, an inability to have peer relationships, or in exhibiting inappropriate behavior, it's a really difficult thing. And the word pervasive mood of depression or unhappiness, that really is really difficult to define, because it is an extraordinarily subjective way of defining it. So the alternative definition, which comes to us through the Council for Children with Behavioral Disorders, I think speaks to a little bit more of concrete, much more objective types of things. And when you read through this, you will see that it is really much more of speaks to a temporary, more than a temporary response to stressful events in our environment. And what you have to also know is that it's consistently exhibited in multiple settings, not just in school and not just in home. What's also important to understand is that it's not responsive to direct intervention in general education settings or typical general education interventions. And I think that's something that we saw a bit described with Emily's situation. in including Samuel. So when we talk to this particular notion, we have to really speak to how it's a clinically derived classification. In other words, through current psychiatric and psychological criteria, the diagnosis involves a lot of observation over time and across multiple settings. And it also is something in which these classifications are statistically derived. In other words, it involves specific categories of behaviors, either externalizing behaviors or internalizing behaviors. So when we talk about general characteristics, you're looking at things that are in categories of anxiety disorder, separation, it could be generalized, panic disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders that you see in repetitive ritual-like behaviors. Mood disorders such as depression that can lead to suicide or bipolar disorders. There's another group of disorders that are under oppositional defiant disorders, and those are exhibited in what appears to be very angry and destructive kinds of behavior, conduct disorder, as well as schizophrenia. So let's make a little bit of a clarification here. When we talk about some of the behavioral characteristics in terms of internalizing or externalizing behavior, the thing that's key to understanding all of our students is that they do not necessarily exhibit all of these behaviors. They don't necessarily exhibit them at the same time, but they can occur simultaneously. So to some extent, these characteristics are very unique to each of these students. So when we think about externalizing behaviors, the word external is that you see that outward behavior, aggression, acting out, non-compliance, bullying. And internalized behaviors are things that you may not see. And oftentimes it takes a trained eye to be able to understand what these look like. Social withdrawal, depression, anxiety, obsessions that may or may not be obvious, and compulsions. One of the things that we want to look at also that does have some direct bearing on teachers is the cognitive and academic characteristics. More often than not, you're looking at these students who are far below grade level in reading and math and writing. Also, they are rated very low on measures in terms of social skills and self-control issues, their behavioral measures. There are higher rates of these students who are held back in grades. We see less retention, I think, in the 21st century, but again, this is sometimes the response, inappropriate as it is for these students, that maybe they have not been really reviewed in terms of what's going on with them. And many of them have either expressive or receptive language disorders. And we will talk about receptive and expressive language disorders as we have previously with other students in these various populations of students with disabilities. The dropout rate for this particular group is much higher than students without disabilities. And you can understand to some extent why. They're not getting the help that they need. And so they just drop out. One of the things we talk about, the origins of why the causality of this is multifaceted. Again, as with many of our other children and students with disabilities, it could be that there's a biological risk factor, some kind of a genetic influence, that there has been some research done in terms of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and obsessive compulsive disorder, as well as Tourette's. So there we have seen in our evidence-based research a genetic component that possibly goes through this. There could also be a biological factor, that maybe it is a result of an infection in childhood, a severe brain injury, lead poisoning. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. Poor nutrition, again, and that can happen before birth and after birth, and possibly toxic exposure. So there are some psychosocial or environmental risk factors, but again, these are confluences that happen that put our students at a higher risk. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a causality. Parental discord, parental mental illness, criminal behavior, poverty, maltreatment, and maybe even maternal rejection, which creates a lot of abandonment and psychological issues for our students. Sorry. One of the things that you want to look at, just in general, is prevalence. And although these are older statistics, I think we want to be very much aware that you're still looking at the sixth largest category for children of this age group, this 6 to 21, receive special education services for emotional disturbance. It's very much an under-identified category. And one of the things is because the stigma that is involved when we speak about the diagnosis in terms of mental health anyway, is exacerbated with this because the majority of our students who have this, their parents may or may not want to have them diagnosed, because as you and I both know, we do in this country have a very difficult time with the realities of problematic issues with mental health. And there's a stigma attached to it. The majority who are identified are typically adolescents. So it's typically children are diagnosed when they're in their teens as opposed to very young children, although that diagnosis in very young children does happen. This is actually in your book, and I think it really speaks to the risk factors involved. We've spoken a lot this semester about how societal risk factors that include poverty and abuse, neglect, really have an impact on our students, and that we also look at the variety of services offered within some of these communities that are lacking because of their socioeconomic status. So when you look at these exposures in that top big yellow box, those can lead to behavioral challenges that we just see in kids, lack of school readiness, defiance of adults, aggression towards peers, And in the short term, those create extremely negative outcomes. They don't go to school, truancy. They have low academic achievement. There are exposed at an early age to possibly drugs and alcohol. And they may or may not get arrested as a result of that. And then that leads into a long-term negative outcomes. And again, they have the higher death and injury rate. They become adults who possibly are involved in criminal behavior. They are seeking for acceptance, and oftentimes that results in gang membership. We have delinquency and we have school failure and ultimately dropout. So it's kids who are at risk from early on have a very long road to hoe in terms of creating success. And part of what we do in school communities is try and mitigate those issues. And one of the things that I think that there's hope to look at in terms of creating resilient kids is what Ginsburg calls the 7 C's. How do we create opportunities for all of our kids, all of our students, but particularly those who are at risk or who within these guidelines of having emotional and behavioral challenges, is how do we build competence, confidence, a connection, character in terms of moral character, how do contributions to themselves as well as society in the long term, coping skills, and also have some sense of self-control. There is additional information that I had put up a short video, again on Blackboard, it's optional, where Dr. Ginsburg speaks of what resiliency in action means and how we as adults can be significant in the lives of kids, especially those who are at risk, to go down that pathway. And one of the things that I think that we have to be aware of is the fact that with the potential for suicide, that there's not just one stressor. It occurs among a lot of different things that the coping abilities of the individual who is suffering from a mental condition can no longer hold that amount of stress that's coming at them. And if you go to, or are interested in more behavior, go to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and look at some more information, because I think it's key that we as teachers look at what the warning signs and the risk factors are. And again, some of the statistics that are out there are pretty frightening. There is a huge stigma around suicide, and it's underreported. So some of these statistics that you see on this particular graphic may or may not be quite as accurate as we'd like to think. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the US, and I heard one author and journalist speak of these deaths as deaths of despair. And each year, 44,000 Americans die, and for every single suicide, there's at least 25 attempts. So suicide costs a lot of money, and it's not just about the money, but we need to look at some of this in terms of need for wraparound services for our students who are at high risk, who don't cope well, who are not resilient. This particular piece was done by CBS. Again, please take your time to stop this video, and this is on Blackboard. I think the takeaway that I'd like you to think about is, what is the most important factor that helps us in prevention? And we will go forward with that. But again, this is an optional video that I've placed on Blackboard in this week's folder. There are lots of other things out there, and we don't have another time in an introductory course to be able to go through this. But there are a lot of different resources out there. I put these two up. One is by Edutopia, which is a very brief article and video about getting started in trauma-informed practices, as well as something that's through the Portland educational system about teaching resilience and trauma. So there's these are resources also on Blackboard for you today and this week. So behavior is, when we look at it, can be frustrating for a teacher. Kids appear to be, quote, out of control, unquote. So as we go forward, we will talk to some of the strategies that we might put in place to help support these kids. And again, this is in your book. It's some of the dimensions of what we see as, quote, problem behavior. Conduct disorder is, physical aggression, children who have difficulty controlling anger. And again, this is not in typical circumstances. This is a chronic mental health issue that needs to be addressed. The other dimensions are socialized aggression. You see how behaviors in the company of others, attention problems and immaturity. To reiterate, this is not a child who has mild attention deficit disorders. These are children who it's part of the entire package, so to speak. And then again, those could be looked at as internalized behaviors, because attention, we don't always see it. It's not always overt like our friend Joey Pixa. Anxiety and withdrawal. Psychotic behaviors, again, are talking about delusions, bizarre ideations, impaired reality, really, that's psychotic behavior, and motor tension to an excess of extreme overreactivity. And again, I caution the fact that just because a child is having a temper tantrum, it doesn't mean that that child fits within this category. One of the ways that we use in teaching is to help scaffold appropriate behavior. And you see the use of social stories in teaching with kids with autism also, to help them learn appropriate behavior. The one on the left is about how to be a good sport. The one on the right, and I believe I put the link in Blackboard for the one on the right, is an interesting social story that talks about resilience in a very amazing graphic way. So I strongly suggest that after watching the lecture, that you take the time to go through the things that are on Blackboard that are optional for you to look at, because I think it gives you a window into some of the strategies that we use in teaching. So right now I am going to stop this video and take a break. This is part 1. So I'm kind of sort of forcing you to take a break, and I will create part 2 as we go.